Welcome back. This week on Perspective, we deal with the issue of Kenya-Somalia. We both partners in terms of business. We share a common border, but the challenges are huge and immense. For example, the Kenya and Somalia maritime border has been in dispute for quite a while. And to help me delve into the issue, I have two gentlemen. I have Dr.Mustafa Ali on my immediate left. Karibu sana.
Thank you.
Mustafa is the chairman of HON, Institute of Strategic Studies, International Institute of Strategic Studies. On my extreme left, we have Mark Bichachi, who is a communication strategist. Perhaps to start right away, the International Institute of Strategic Studies. What do you exactly deal with?
Yeah, thanks, Njue. The HON International Institute of Strategic Studies is a think tank. It's a think-do tank where we follow very closely this kind of conflicts, a misunderstanding, disputes between countries in the Horn of Africa, the challenges to do with violent extremism and terrorism, security and defense, foreign policy and diplomacy, and carry out research around such issues in order to produce policy briefs, advice to organizations that are interested in our research. Basically, what we do is to engage other scholars, work with us to produce knowledge. We are in the business of knowledge production.
Karibu sana.
Thank you.
Thank you. Into the issue of Kenya-Somalia, from 16th February, there have been discussions, there have been coverage, there have been immense pressure from both sides. What exactly is of interest where Kenya and Somalia are sharing the maritime border?
Well, basically what is going on is that Somalia is claiming part of Kenya's territory. Somalia is claiming close to 100,000 square kilometers of what has been Kenya's territory for the last 40 years, since Kenya proclaimed that section of Indian Ocean Island to be its territory within the context of the UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea. And so that in 2005 there was a proclamation by a presidential proclamation after the first, based on what the United Nations basically calls on states to proclaim and to identify what their borders look like. Now in 2014, what Somalia did was to basically take Kenya to the ICC, and part of Somalia's claim is that Kenya is encroaching on its territorial waters of Indian Ocean Island. But of course, that kind of a claim is neither here nor there, because if you look at how the activities, naval activities by the Kenyan Navy, fishing activities by the Kenyan fishermen, they've been operating unhindered in that part, in that section of the waters that belongs to Kenya for ages. And 40 years ago, of course, Kenya proclaimed its, proclaimed rather through a presidential proclamation that part belongs to Kenya. So Somalia has taken Kenya to the ICJ, which is scheduled to rule later this year.
Okay, we'll be delving into the issue of the ICJ. Bonamark, what is Kenya exactly claiming? Is it because of the territorial waters? Is it fishing? Is it business?
I think the right term is that Kenya is claiming. It is Somalia that is claiming. Kenya has always been on the right. This is what I mean. And Kenyans need to understand this issue from perspective. And as a strategist, I always go back to the history so you understand where the problem came from. If you go back to the 60s when we had the Shifter War, you'll understand that the Somali Republic has always had the desire to occupy Kenyan land. In fact, as far as Meru, Now, for me, what this is, it's an extension of the shifter war, where they could not win on land, they're trying to fight on the sea. That's essentially what it is. So Kenya is saying that from 1979, this border was declared properly and legally, okay? You've accepted it. And in fact, in 2007, 2008, we signed an agreement between the Prime Minister of Somalia and the Kenyan government, and they agreed that indeed this is their boundary. They then changed their mind, Trump style, after the fact to say that, you know what, we want more stake in this. And this is a classic case of an expansionist ideology that they've had from the beginning of the Somali Republic. Somalia, interestingly enough, is the only country that did not ratify the Organization of African Unity agreement on that the boundaries that were set by colonial powers should remain. So as non-signatories to that treaty, you can clearly see with the border disputes between them and Ethiopia, between them and Kenya, over many decades, that this is just an expansion of the same. It is a selfish claim. And if you look at the boundary between Kenya and Tanzania, and then you look at what Kenya had declared as a boundary between it and Somalia, you can see it's very fair. But if we continue on this trajectory, the one that Somalia wants, it would effectively make sure that no ship can ever dock in Kenya without passing through Somali territorial waters or Tanzanian territorial waters, essentially making us basically landlocked. Number two, if you look at where the line is, that the boundary that Somalia is trying to claim, and you see its proximity to the port of Lamu, then you'll see a clear and present danger, for the simple reason that we've been fighting Al-Shabaab how many years now? Almost 10 years. And now you want for us to put our newest asset, our deepest port, next to this boundary. So obviously this is an infringement on our rights, it's an infringement on our security, and it's trying also to turn back the historical clock.
Maybe on the same, before we go to the ICJ, as Dr. has said, how have other countries solved disputes, such disputes?
Now, that's an interesting question, because what other countries have done is they've sat on a table and agreed on what is fair and equitable for both people. So there are people who followed longitudinal lines, there are people who followed the lines that the equative lines, so that it's equal distance from both sides. Now, different countries have different mixes, but they've all decided to have that discussion among themselves. The trickery that Somalia is using, and I'm not ashamed to say this, is number one, they've taken us to a court whose president is also a Somali. Let's start there. Number two, they've also taken us through a process where they pretended to be negotiating. They say they're landing here on the 27th of August 2014, and then on the 28th, they've gone to the court behind our back to file this case. So what does that tell you? That Somalia is playing underhanded tricks to try and trick us off of our birthright.
Daktari, do you support it, bearing in mind we've been helping Somalia, and especially to pacify the borders?
Yeah, of course, yes. I think this was a major miscalculation on the part of Somalia. First of all, the allegations, of course, that Somalia auctioned, or got a company that auctioned, Somalia auctioned blocks 230, 231, 232, yes, 233, a major miscalculation on the part of Somalia, because that's Kenya's territory that Somalia is selling and trying to go ahead and sell. But in terms of addressing this particular dispute between Kenya and Somalia, well, there are three ways to do it. One is negotiation, and that's the best in terms of a negotiated settlement is always what the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea, Clause 1, 2, 3, always envisage and ask the parties that are dealing with such kind of issues to actually go back, bilaterally negotiate and address it. If that fails, then there's conciliation or the use of good offices, which I guess hasn't really been used as such, except when now we see President Abiy Ahmed coming to Nairobi and trying to mediate between Kenya and Somalia, and the judicial process, the arbitration, where now Somalia has taken Kenya to the ICJ. Now, there are dangers here. If you look at Kenya, Bichachi talked about equity and proportionality. If Somalia is going to take that, or Somalia claims is given what it's claiming, then Kenya is going to lose about 26% of the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, and is also going to lose about 85% of the continental shelf. Now, of course, Somalia has one of the largest coastlines in the world, and it stands very little to gain the 100,000 square kilometers that it's claiming from Kenya, which Kenya needs.
The one in contention.
Precisely, the one in contention, which if it takes, then Kenya loses 85%. Now, if Somalia gets that, it's hardly 10% of what it has. It has 700,000 square kilometers. That's greed. Let's put it that way. There are, of course, precedents, the way ICJ has ruled over other cases, the Nigeria versus Cameroon over the Bichachi Peninsula, where the ICJ ruled in favor of Cameroon, and Cameroon kept the Bichachi Peninsula. Nigerian learned lessons then to go to ICJ, so when it had its issues with the Sao Tome and Principe archipelago in the Gulf of Guinea, where there is a huge gas and oil deposit, what those two countries actually agreed was to form a joint commission. They never went to ICJ. They came together, sat and addressed the issues, and are now sharing, or have agreed to actually prospect for oil and gas jointly, and are sharing in the profits.
Maybe back to ICJ, Bwana Bichachi. Now that the case is already there, we've had examples of Norway and Russia, where the border dispute has taken 40 years, bearing in mind that it's still the same court, ICJ. Do you think we might be able to maybe take that long?
Well, to be honest with you, it can take very long. Okay, that's the reality. And as the good doctor here has said, the best way is to negotiate. Okay, and to negotiate in terms of fairness, what is fair. Okay, so if you already have a cake that is 10 times bigger than mine, and then you come to argue about my small cake, then clearly there is something amiss there. So in the interest, and I always like to reduce things to the basic. If you want to say you are just, then you can explain that justice to a 7-year-old and he'll agree with you. So what needs to happen is Somalia needs to realize very quickly that it needs Kenya more than Kenya needs Somalia. Let's just be clear. In terms of the support we give them, in terms of the military, in terms of how many years did we house the Somali government in Kenya, all right? So that relationship worth losing over what is relatively a small piece of the continental shelf in comparison to what Somalia has. So the ideal scenario is for Somalia to come back to the negotiating table and say, you know what, let's agree between ourselves. Because what happens at the ICJ is it will drag out as long as possible, because it and then that then affects both countries and their ability to make use of that land. And that's why Somalia, in a very sneaky manner, in South Africa and various oil platforms, they've begun to auction off these blocks of 291 and 231 and 232, and they began to auction them off. In other words, they're posturing. They're trying to push the gauntlet as far as it can go, which is an illegality. Because if you and I have a dispute about land, we know I cannot put that land on sale. Neither can you. But when one of us decides to put our shamba in Rongai and wherever it is, someone is trying to con the other. That's just basic human understanding, human knowledge, and Daktari will agree with me. So for Somalia to do that, it is also a sign of bad faith. It is not just a sign of bad faith in regards to the Kenyan sovereignty and the Kenyan rights, but it's a sign of bad faith in the sense that they're saying that the court case is a foregone conclusion. Now one has to ask, why would they have such confidence that even before the judge has declared the land yours of mine, one of us has already decided to sell it? And those are the questions that you have to ask, because what is informing these things? Because governments think the same way as people. So you can clearly see that the Somali Somali government is up to no good.
Daktari, Kenya and Somalia have been friends, business partners, we share the same border. Them taking us to ICJ just because of a maritime dispute, as opposed to us solving it internally, does it affect our relationship with Somalia in terms of business, in terms of, remember we still are in the AMISOM?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, as Bichachi has mentioned, the action that Somalia has taken is in bad faith. You don't take your friend to that court out there to try and deal with an issue that the two of you can actually deal with, negotiate, and come to a negotiated solution. The second point here is Somalia is quite unstable. First of all, the fact that Somalia can think of, in a very opaque manner, sell off oil blocks, while it's still under an interim constitution, while it is such unstable, while it is in, there isn't some kind of permanence in terms of the governance and all that is there, baffles me, because it might create chaos inside Somalia. You could see actually the Somalis in London were actually, demonstrating against that particular conference that was going on in London. But what is important here, Njue, is that Kenya and Somalia has enjoyed cordial relations. Kenya has been helping Somalia for a very long time. Kenya is part of the AMISOM contingent that is trying to pin down Al-Shabaab so that they cannot be much of a bother to the Somali national government. And Kenya is working with other partners in the context of the African Union and the United Nations to try and stabilize Somalia. Now, when Somalia takes Kenya to the ICJ, it means that it is undermining, or it wishes to undermine, or maybe it doesn't know that it's undermining that kind of relationship that it has had with Kenya for a very long time. But when you see Somalia taking such an action, a country very unstable, just coming out of a failed status, then you need to know that there are other countries behind Somalia. And I suspect there are a few countries behind Somalia in this kind of an action. Norway, perhaps, United Kingdom, perhaps, could be the other country that is behind Somalia. Remember that it is Soma Oil and Spectrum, what's this company, Spectrum, that a Norwegian company, and Soma Oil, which is a British company, which was founded and owned by the current Somali Prime Minister and Lord Howard. And these guys, what they did in London actually that led to the FSO, that is some crime agency in UK, to actually raid their offices because of the opaque, corrupt manner in which Soma Oil has been carrying out its activities. Now you have this foreign entity in the United Kingdom coming here to prospect for oil, and it's not a company that has been there for a long time. It was just registered a few months back, and all of a sudden they are actually engaging in these seismic surveys and all that. It means that there is more than meets the eye on this, and Kenya has got to deal with that. Perhaps Kenya has to maybe speak to Norway and the United Kingdom to try and address this issue. But we want to encourage Somalia, and a piece of advice to Somalia is to actually come and negotiate with Kenya. They will lose that case, and then they will lose a lot more because of that case, that this goodwill that Kenya has and many other countries in the region actually has.
Mr. Bichachi, your take on this?
Well, the question is very simple, and I like asking simple questions. If I give you an acre in Wajir in Kenya or an acre in Mogadishu, which one are you taking?
Okay.
You have to be absolutely insane to buy land from Somalia. So you have to ask yourself, what kind of unscrupulous business people would decide to get those blocks from Somalia? You see, so of course, if it talks like a rat, walks like a rat, and you smell a rat, then definitely it's a rat. So let's be clear. This whole thing has, you can smell corruption in it, you can smell international influence in it, you can tell that it's clearly very personal interests in it, because the question is, if a Somali prime minister signed an agreement with Kenya. If said Bare agreed with Kenya's boundaries, why is it that now suddenly our boundaries are in question? It is simply because there are selfish interests that are trying to rewrite history to the advantage of the Somali, and not just not the Somali people, by the way, the Somali elite. You've had the title of the person who's in Soma company. So clearly you can tell this has been an agenda to undermine Kenya for the profit of a few people in Somali, using unscrupulous business people who have no problem buying a deal in a land that is in dispute. No one would ever do that unless you know you've manipulated the system to your advantage. That's the clear picture here.
From the other than the maritime boundary, we also share a common border.
Yes.
And the security has been a thorn in the flesh for both countries, and especially Kenya, because of the threat of the Al-Shabaab.
Yes.
We have our soldiers there, although we have taken some off. How is the security issue, bearing in mind we still have another border that is not actually in question?
You see, the thing is, and this is what Somalia needs to wake up very quickly and smell the coffee. They are not out of the woods yet. Okay, the kind, if you look at the kind of chaos that is in their parliament, if you look at the kind of craziness, in fact, Somalia as we speak today does not practice democracy, because what happens is their parliament is made up of warlords. So the question is, if your country is kept secure using foreign forces, if your democracy only works by rule of the gun, if your country is bombed every 2 days, in fact, just in the paper yesterday, there was a bombing in Mogadishu. If your country is in that state, how then would you go picking the nose of your neighbor? It is obviously a foolish idea. Now, you've said that there is danger on Kenya and Somalia side. No. There's a lot more danger on the Somali side, because Al-Shabaab may be on the decline, but it's not defeated. Al-Shabaab still has access to a lot of money. Talking about maritime, who helped Somalia handle the issue of piracy? Who helped Somalia deal with the pirates that were all over the border? Who helped Somalia deal with the amount of foreign currency that was coming in through piracy? It is Kenya. So literally, Somalia is that little child who's still suckling on its mother and then begins to abuse its mother. That's what Somalia is doing.
Dr. Your take on this in matters of security, bearing in mind we've had some Al-Shabaab attacks in the recent past.
Yeah, first of all, you know, laws, conventions, peremptory norms are not just, you know, statutes to be kept there as maridadi. Countries have to abide by those international statutes, and Somalia has got to abide to those international conventions. Kenya does abide by all those international conventions. Now, when it comes to the issue of security here, Al-Shabaab, although it has lost ground, territory, its military capability has been degraded, diminished. The ideological infrastructure that Al-Shabaab still has is massive. And so it will take Somalia a long time to actually demolish that ideological infrastructure that it has. And it will have to depend on its neighbors to actually degrade, diminish, and demolish this ideological infrastructure. We see today that yesterday ISIS, you know, the US and other partners of the US declared that ISIS is no longer holding territory. But now ISIS becomes even more dangerous because it's not holding territory. Most of its fighters have gone sleeping now in various cities. Some have moved to Philippines, some have got into here, Somalia, some will come into Kenya, and other, you know, all these borders are very porous. And therefore, the collective action by the international community, particularly by neighbors, in the case of the Horn of Africa, the neighbors in the Horn of Africa helping Somalia to defeat Al-Shabaab is going to take time. And Somalia, you know, oil and prospecting oil and gas should not really be an issue now for Somalia. Somalia needs to stabilize its country to make its house safe first before it can drill that oil and gas out of the fields that they wish to. Otherwise, it just becomes a curse and is going to, you know, affect that country negatively.
Bichachi, Has Kenya played a good neighbor, having been taken to the ICJ? We could put sanctions to Somalia, just like the West usually do to Africa countries. Is Kenya behaving like a good neighbor, having a case at the ICJ and still helping out Somalia?
The biggest refugee camp is in Kenya. Kenya has hosted Rwandese, South Sudanese, Somalians for years. Okay, Kenya has always been a good neighbor. If you look at the case of Migingo, for example, how civil, how disciplined has Kenya been with significantly economically weaker Uganda, landlocked Uganda? If today Kenya closed its port to Uganda, Ugandans would starve. But what have we been? We've always been the country that has taken the high road. In fact, even now as we speak, Somalia has faced very little consequence in their indiscipline towards the country and the Republic of Kenya. Now, Kenya, is it a good big brother? Yes, it is. For a country that has never seen war, for a country that has never faced the ravages these other countries have faced, look at how many Somalis are hosted in Kenya. Look at how much help and aid we give to Somalia, despite our state as a third world country. So the facts are clear. Kenya has never interfered with the integrity of Somalia. And if you want to prove that, Somalia declared war on Kenya in the Shifter Wars in the 60s. We defended our territory. Not once was a Somali soldier in Somalia touched, was a Somali parliamentarian, a Somali leader touched by the Kenyan government. How much more can Kenya show its statesmanship, its gentlemanhood, its ability to stand by treaties across? We have a treaty that was signed in the 1920s concerning the River Nile. How many years have we not built dams? How many Kenyans died in Budalangi because we respect that treaty? So Kenya has demonstrated, not just to Somalia, but to the rest of Africa, that we respect them and we always want to negotiate versus any other form of action. So the facts are clear.
Dr. Mustafa, what do we stand to lose if ICJ ruled in the favor of Somalia?
Yeah, first of all, we're going to lose a major chunk of our territory. We're going to lose 100,000 square kilometers. We're going, of that 100,000 square kilometers, we're going to, 26% is going to be on the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, and 85% of that is going to be on the continental shelf. And that sets such a terrible precedent in terms of what really Kenya holds dear in terms of its territorial integrity, which each and every Kenyan must stand for, and a patriotic duty to actually defend that. Now, that area, irrespective whether it has hydrocarbons and whatever, it's part of Kenya's territory. And if then Kenya loses that, it means that even ships that are plying the Red Sea, India, coming all the way, have got to do quite a bit of a turnaround. It's like having Kenya blockaded from the sea. And Kenya cannot afford to do that. And as Bichachi is saying, Kenya is not, Kenya is a powerful country in the region. Kenya has the most sophisticated army. Kenya, no other country has such a navy in this, part except South Africa. And so for countries to just, poke their noses on Kenya's affair, perhaps they don't know what they're dealing, because Kenya can actually apply the coercive diplomacy and engage in other ways, which Kenya has not done, by the way, to an extent of declaring war. And it can, but it chooses not to do that because it understands what war means. And so we call upon, and I hope people are listening to us and to Kenyans, we call upon them to actually make judgments and decisions that are not going to trouble them.
Mr. Bichachi, our relationship with Somalia, if the ruling goes south?
Well, if the ruling goes south, Kenya has many options. AMISOM is one. Two is to make it difficult for Somalia to trade with Kenya, which by the way, just as a basic, if you look at how many Somalis actually depend on Somalis on this side and Kenyans on this side to trade with them, then the use of military force. So there is so much that could go wrong for Somalia, and there is so little that could go wrong for Kenya. And Somalia is not in the kind of place anyway to push a lot of international actors to act against Kenya. Kenya has much more allies. It is more strategic. If you look at the partnership, military partnerships we have with the Americans, with the Israelis, with the British, it's really a difficult place for Somalia to play in. So whether economically or militarily or even in the international diplomatic stage, Kenya wins that match before it begins. Let's just be very clear. And so far we are playing the gentleman's game. We pray that it will not go that far. But for me, I'm not afraid in terms of Kenya's ability to respond to Somalia in any shape, way or form. What we really need to pray for is that Somalia will come to its senses, come to the negotiating table, and basically agree that if something has been in place for 40 years, then obviously it is not time to begin to change and rewrite history.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. We are out of time, but thanks so much for coming. We were speaking to two gentlemen. We were with Dr. Mustafa Yusuf Ali, who is a chairman of HON, International Institute of Strategic Studies, and Mark Bichachi, our communications strategist. Gentlemen, I'm hoping Kenya is going to find an amicable solution to this. That's all for Perspective for today. We're back with more news.